Vladimir Putin blames the West for Russia's war on Ukraine. That's where we begin this hour. Putin's speech is being watched worldwide this morning for any indication of where the fighting could go next.
За Россию! За победу! Ура!
The Russian president ending his speech with a rallying cry at the military parade in Moscow. The annual celebration marks the Soviet Union's role in the defeat of Nazi Germany. It's a traditional show of Russian military might. Putin's remarks have special importance this year because of the war in Ukraine. His speech today is seen as a driving force behind the intensifying Russian offensive in the Donbass and the unrelenting assault on Ukrainian cities. There's been speculation ahead of his address that Putin would declare total war and even signal potential conflict beyond Ukraine's borders. Julia Chapman leads off our coverage from Moscow. Julia, thanks for joining us. Putin's speech now wrapped up. What did he say?
Well, there was no major announcement by the Russian president when he addressed the armed forces on Red Square and indeed the entire country, projecting Moscow's strength both domestically and internationally. And he did indeed focus on the so-called special military operation in Ukraine, as the Kremlin insists that we call it here. Of course, we're operating under reporting restrictions here in Russia now, but he went over his justification for the operation in Ukraine, saying again that this was because Ukraine was planning to stage a provocation in eastern Ukraine. President Putin claiming that it was self-defense, that Russia was trying to protect itself from an external threat. He also claimed that Ukraine was trying to take back Russian annexed Crimea by force, something that Ukrainian officials have, of course, denied. But he also had a warning for the West, and this is what he said in his speech earlier.
Russia called on the West for an honest dialogue, reasonable compromise solutions in the interests of each other. But that was in vain. The NATO countries did not want to hear us. And that means that, in fact, they had very different plans, and we could see that.
Victory Day, long been an important day for the Russian people. Vladimir Putin himself has worked to make it central to Russian society under his presidency. So let's talk about the mood there today with Russia waging this war on its neighbor.
That's right. Victory Day is always a huge celebration here in Moscow and indeed around the country, with this major parade being held later in the day. Up to 1 million Russians will take to the streets of Moscow carrying pictures of their ancestors who either fought in or survived the Second World War. Of course, the Soviet Union suffered the greatest losses during that conflict. There's hardly a family in Russia that hasn't been touched by it. And that is why we will still see many people here in Russia taking to the streets today. The crowds during the parade were pretty substantial. Anecdotally, here on this spot where we stood last year, I would say this year there were certainly more people. There was a jubilant mood. People were excited to see the tanks going by. It is difficult to know exactly what extent of the population conflates this memorial of the Second World War with what is going on in Ukraine right now. According to state pollsters, there is wide support for the Russian action in Ukraine, but under the circumstances, it's very difficult to gauge the accuracy of those responses.
Julia, thanks for this. Julia Chapman reporting in Moscow. Well, no doubt Putin's speech has the full attention of Ukraine's government. And this morning, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is giving a defiant speech of his own. CBC News senior defense writer Murray Brewster has that story from Kyiv.
It was a contrast. It was a tale, I guess, of two Victory Day celebrations, because here in Kyiv, normally there is a Victory Day parade, because Victory Day is something that was significant to the Ukrainians because they, of course, participated in the Second World War. And the contrast is that President Volodymyr Zelensky released a video of him walking down one of the commercial streets, an empty street here in Kyiv. He was pointing out some of the tank barriers that are here, and highlighting how how Ukrainians fought against Nazis in the Second World War, and he was very determined to say that the eastern regions, which are occupied currently by Russian forces, are going to be liberated. They're going to be liberated from the oppression that he says has been inflicted upon Ukraine. His Putin's speech was watched very carefully here today, watched very carefully for signs of possible escalation of the conflict. We didn't see any of those signs in Vladimir Putin's speech. There was no general mobilization. There was no declaration of full-on war. But there is still a great deal of tension here in Kyiv because they are expecting continued fighting in Odessa today, which is in the major southern port city. There were 4 missile strikes. We don't have any indication at the moment of damage or casualties, but for Ukraine, the war is continuing.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Zelensky is also praising Canada after yesterday's surprise visit, surprise for security reasons, of course, to Kyiv by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, and Foreign Minister Melanie Joly. It was a headline-making moment. What about the substance of those talks? What do we know?
Well, the big takeaway is that the Canadian embassy has been reopened in Kyiv. There has been a political controversy back in Canada about why it has not been opened earlier, but the Prime Minister participated in a flag-raising ceremony and then met with President Zelensky afterwards. Interestingly, I'll note for you, John, that as the two of them were meeting, we were standing outside of the presidential palace and air raid sirens were going off all over Kyiv. So they met against a rather dramatic backdrop. From a substance point of view, the Prime Minister came in offering more financial support, but he also came in offering extra military equipment, including significantly ammunition for the 4 M777 howitzers that Canada has given to Ukraine, and promised more military support for the country, including access to satellite imaging and other military equipment. The two of them talked about how Canada can influence NATO allies. NATO allies that have heavier military equipment than Canada does. There are some NATO allies that are reluctant to give Ukraine that equipment. And Zelensky made a point of saying that he believes that Trudeau is the person to be able to convince them to help Ukraine further.
CBC News senior defense writer Murray Brewster in Kyiv.